Federal Courthouse, Chicago. Jasmine Crockett had barely taken her seat, less than 1 minute in, when she was hit with a $25,000 fine. No hearing, no evidence. But with just a few razor-sharp questions and a legal mind like a scalpel, she froze the entire courtroom. Within minutes, a senior judge had to be summoned to contain the fallout. By the end, the law itself was re-examined, and Jasmine became a national symbol of justice. What kind of woman can shake an entire judicial system using nothing but the law in her mind? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Rain hammered the stone steps of the Chicago Federal Courthouse as if trying to wash something dark off its walls. Inside, everything felt wrong. Cold, quiet, too controlled. Jasmine Crockett stepped through security with calm precision, her heels echoing down the hallway. This was supposed to be a simple procedural hearing, nothing more. But the summons had been vague, and the courtroom was oddly empty. No opposing counsel, no normal chatter, just silence and watching eyes. She sat down, didn't open her briefcase, didn't speak. Something about the air told her this wasn't justice, it was an ambush. At exactly 9 a.m., the doors opened. Judge Malcolm Travers entered like a man arriving to deliver a sentence, not hear a case. His silver hair was razor neat, his eyes unreadable, and his mouth set in a line that had silenced hundreds. No eye contact, no nod, no words. He didn't acknowledge Jasmine's presence. He didn't need to. He sat without ceremony, adjusted his robe, and looked straight ahead. No review of the file, no opening remarks, no standard formalities. Just an oppressive silence, heavy with intent. In that moment, Jasmine knew. Justice wasn't the purpose of this room. Control was. Judge Travers didn't look up. He didn't ask for opening statements or even confirm Jasmine Crockett's presence. He opened his mouth and fired the first shot like it was routine. This court finds the defendant, Jasmine Crockett, in flagrant violation of State Code 22F, he announced, his voice as cold and clipped as a gunshot, echoing in a metal chamber. Accordingly, a civil penalty of $25,000 is imposed. Effective immediately, this matter is concluded. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't care. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a room that had just been sucker punched. A few people in the back shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered, "Wait, what?" But no one answered. No evidence had been introduced, no arguments heard, no process followed. Jasmine hadn't even opened her mouth. Yet here she was, fined more than most Americans make in 6 months, without a single second to respond. And the worst part? Travers acted like it was just another line item on his calendar, just another defendant to flatten. Jasmine didn't move. Her back stayed perfectly straight, eyes locked on the judge like a hunter tracking a predator. She didn't shout, didn't protest, but every cell in her body screamed that something was wrong, very wrong. She had spent her life inside courtrooms, knew their rhythms, their protocols, their unwritten codes of respect, even when the system was flawed. But this wasn't flawed. This was rigged. Judge Travers leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his eyes hollow with quiet contempt. "Ms. Crockett," he said, "I suggest you pay promptly. Any delay will result in additional penalties and possible enforcement action." His tone was brutal, bureaucratic, like he was discussing a parking ticket, not dropping a financial hammer without due process. "If you have objections, file them elsewhere. This courtroom is not your stage." It was meant to humiliate her, publicly, thoroughly, not just as an attorney, but as a woman, a black woman, who dared to walk into his courtroom with authority and confidence. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't about a statute. This wasn't about law. This was about dominance. Travers wanted her small, silent, and out of the way. And the message was clear. You don't belong here. And if you do, you will kneel. But Jasmine Crockett had faced bigger bullies than this man in a robe. She had taken on corporations, political machines, and backroom legal deals that would make most attorneys run. She had buried cases with truth and rebuilt broken clients with nothing but fire in her voice and facts in her hands. Jasmine stood slowly, deliberately, like a soldier rising under fire. No sudden movements, no tremble in her voice, just calm steel. "Your Honor," she said, voice even, clear, and sharp enough to slice through the tension thickening the room. "I haven't been allowed to present a single argument. This isn't a ruling, it's a pre-written sentence." Her words didn't echo because of volume. They echoed because everyone had stopped breathing. A clerk shifted. Someone in the gallery dropped a pen. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but somehow she had just flipped the energy of the entire courtroom. She wasn't asking for permission. She was naming the injustice and making sure everyone heard it. Judge Travers didn't blink. He didn't lean back. He didn't show even the courtesy of pretending to consider her words. Instead, he delivered his response like a slap. "Argument is unnecessary," he snapped. "The violation is clear. The law is clear." His tone was mechanical, almost rehearsed. But there was venom beneath the surface. Cold, deliberate contempt. His gaze fixed on Jasmine, not like a judge weighing facts, but like a man annoyed that she hadn't accepted her punishment in silence. The message was unmistakable. "You speak only when I allow it. And right now I don't." It wasn't just dismissal, it was erasure, and it landed with all the brutality of a gavel wielded like a weapon. Jasmine didn't need more words to see the truth. It was already written across the judge's face, in his tone, in the calculated finality of his actions. This wasn't about a minor code violation. This wasn't about law at all. It was about dominance. It was about reminding her who controlled the room, who had the microphone, the bench, the authority. Travers hadn't just handed down a fine, he had thrown down a gauntlet, and he had chosen her, not by accident, but by design. She wasn't a defendant to him, she was an example, a target, a warning to anyone else who dared to walk in with intellect, backbone, and no fear in her voice. Jasmine understood it with absolute clarity. This was war in a courtroom's clothing. She inhaled once, controlled, calm, then spoke again, this time with full precision. "Your Honor, I respectfully request the opportunity to present my defense." The room tensed. Travers didn't answer right away. He looked at her, jaw set, eyes hard. And for a moment the silence stretched so tight it felt like something might snap. Then finally a clipped response. "You may proceed, though it won't change the outcome." His voice carried the weight of disdain, like her words were already irrelevant before they were spoken. He hadn't granted permission out of fairness. He had done it to watch her fail, or so he thought. Jasmine gave a slight nod, not of submission, but of strategy. If he was going to give her the floor, even begrudgingly, she was about to turn that floor into fire. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The power was in her precision. She reached into her folder and pulled out a crisp document, holding it with the confidence of someone who didn't just know the law, she had lived inside it. Her voice was calm, but each word landed like a legal grenade. "Your Honor, I'd like to refer this court to Sullivan v. State of Illinois, Appellate Division, 2018. She walked slowly, deliberately toward the bench, holding the paper up like it was a mirror, daring the judge to look into it. In that case, a $500 administrative fine was overturned because the issuing authority failed to provide objective evidence. No photos, no written reports, no witness testimony. The court ruled that due process had been violated. That ruling was clear then, and it's even more relevant now." She paused, locking eyes with Travers. "What we're dealing with today isn't a $500 fine. It's $25,000, issued without a shred of admissible evidence. Nothing. Not one photo, not one report. Just an accusation, followed by an instant judgment." She let the silence stretch, just long enough for the weight of the number, $25,000, to hang in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to put out. "And yet, I'm standing here being told the law is clear. That argument is unnecessary." Her tone didn't waver, but it sharpened, cutting through the courtroom's stillness. "But Sullivan says otherwise. Sullivan says the moment a court allows punishment without proof, it ceases to be a court and becomes a weapon." She moved no closer, but her presence filled the room. "The appellate court held, and I quote, No financial penalty may be imposed absent a factual basis that can be independently verified by the accused. That's not just legal theory, that's binding precedent in this jurisdiction. She turned slightly, addressing the gallery without taking her eyes off the judge. This isn't about me. It's about whether this courtroom honors the law or overrides it for convenience, or worse, for control. Her hand stayed steady. Her breathing never quickened, but the pressure in the room built with every word. Then she turned fully to face Trevor's, and this time, her voice carried a different kind of energy. Not just legal expertise, but moral authority. You imposed this fine before a hearing began, before a single piece of evidence was examined. That's not just premature, it's unconstitutional. She held up the page again. Sullivan didn't happen in theory. It happened in a real courtroom, with real consequences, and it set a real limit on judicial overreach. Her gaze locked with his. And right now, that limit has been crossed. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was suffocating. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a beat. No one moved. Not the gallery, not the clerks, and certainly not Judge Trevor. He sat still, but his jaw clenched. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. She wasn't here to plead. She wasn't here to argue her worth. She was here to remind the court of the very rules it had sworn to uphold. And at that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room. The balance of power had just shifted. She let the courtroom breathe just for a moment, after dismantling the $25,000 fine. But only for a moment. Then she turned, placed a fresh document gently on the edge of the bench, and locked eyes with Judge Trevor's. Her tone didn't rise, but the shift was unmistakable. She wasn't just defending herself now. She was prosecuting the system. Let's talk about the statute you're leaning on, Your Honor. State Code 22F, she began, voice level, every word measured and deadly. It's 2 paragraphs long. 2. In those 86 words, there isn't a single clear threshold, not one defined term, and 0 measurable standards. She stepped away from the bench, pacing slowly but deliberately, speaking like she was teaching a class she'd taught 100 times. It uses phrases like excessive noncompliance, public obstruction, and failure to observe municipal directives. But nowhere does it define what those phrases mean. Is it an inch off a sidewalk line? A missing permit tag? Too many people standing outside a building? The statute doesn't say. And that's the problem. She turned back to the bench, her voice tightening. Because when a law is vague, it becomes a tool, not of justice, but of control. It allows enforcers to interpret it however they want, against whomever they want, whenever they want. She held up a stack of papers, each marked with case names. This isn't conjecture. This isn't hypothetical. This statute has already been reviewed and rejected by 3 separate courts in this state. I've printed the rulings for your convenience. She walked up to the lectern, flipped to the first document. In Carson versus State of Illinois, 2017, the judge dismissed the case on the grounds that, quote, Code 22F fails to provide fair notice and encourages arbitrary enforcement by state officials. The court found that the defendant had no way of knowing what action specifically triggered the citation. The officer cited public obstruction because the individual was standing on a sidewalk talking to a friend. She let that sink in before continuing. Bryant v. City of Oak Hill, 2019, same ruling. This time the code was used to fine a shop owner for allegedly improper signage. No standards, no photo evidence. Fine overturned, and the city issued a public apology. And then, Santos versus Chicago Municipal, 2021, a parking lot dispute where 22F was used to justify towing and fining a disabled veteran. Case dismissed. Judge's ruling called the statute a textbook example of legislative overreach. Her eyes returned to Trevor's, steady and sharp. This statute doesn't hold. It doesn't survive scrutiny. It doesn't meet constitutional standards for enforceability. And yet, you invoked it. Without evidence, without discussion, without process. She stepped forward again. Why? Why would a federal judge rely on a local municipal code that's already been thrown out by 3 courts? She didn't need to answer. The implication hung in the air like a loaded gun left on a table. Either you didn't know, which is troubling, or you knew and didn't care, which is worse. Her tone turned razor thin. Because that would mean this fine, this proceeding was never about the law. It was about power. About reminding me that no matter how strong my case is, no matter how clean my record, I could still be pulled into this courtroom and forced to explain myself for nothing. The courtroom was silent, not frozen, held, like everyone was waiting to see if the judge would even move. Jasmine's voice softened slightly, but the tension didn't ease. Code 22F isn't a law, it's a loophole, a legal landmine waiting to be stepped on by the wrong person. Today, that person was me. Her eyes narrowed. But it won't be again, because now it's on the record. Now it's public, and now it's yours to justify. She let her final words on Code 22F echo into silence, then turned, not to the judge this time, but to the room itself. She turned away from the bench, not out of defiance, but by design. She needed the room to see themselves in her place. Every clerk, every observer, every man who had ever been fined for something he didn't understand, every worker who had been written up without cause. She looked at them, hard, and spoke with deliberate calm. If I can stand here today, she began, voice firm but controlled, and be fined $25,000 without a single piece of evidence, then what makes any of you think you're safe tomorrow? Her words didn't shout, but they shook. If a judge can punish me, an attorney, without due process, what do you think happens to the man who doesn't know the law? The man who can't afford one? The man who's just trying to survive a system built to wear him down? A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Older men straightened in their seats. The bailiff shifted his stance. Even the court reporter hesitated, hands hovering above her keys. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. This is bigger than me. This is a mirror. And if you're watching, you're in it. She let the silence stretch, just long enough to make the tension crackle. Today it's 25,000. No photos, no signed reports, no evidence. Just a signature on a form and a rubber-stamped guilty. That's all it took. Her voice lowered now. Not weaker, just tighter, sharper. That means a parking mistake becomes a misdemeanor. A paperwork error becomes a crime. A conversation on the wrong corner becomes a public disruption. She held up the sheet of paper with the fine amount, letting it flutter slightly as she spoke. They call this law. I call it a loaded gun with no safety, and today it was aimed at me. Jasmine turned, her voice swelling now with quiet fire. But make no mistake, what's being tested here isn't just a legal statute. It's the foundation of due process itself. And if that crumbles here, in front of your eyes, then tomorrow, your silence becomes your signature. That landed heavy, the kind of line that didn't need explanation. A man in the gallery let out a breath he'd been holding. Another leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on Jasmine. She saw it. She felt it. They weren't just listening, they were remembering. Remembering the parking ticket that never made sense, the building inspector who never left a form, the citation with no appeal, the hearing they couldn't attend because no one told them it had already passed. And then came the line that would live longer than the case itself. If the system can find me without proof today, she said, slow and deliberate, then it can find any man in this room tomorrow, just because someone in power said so. The room didn't move. The air itself seemed to freeze, held hostage by the truth of it. That sentence wasn't rhetoric. It wasn't theory. It was a warning etched in reality, and every single person there knew it. Judge Travers leaned back in his chair, but it wasn't relaxation. It was recoil. The corners of his mouth pulled tight, his knuckles pale around the gavel. Jasmine's words had landed harder than any attorney's objection ever had. Not because they were loud, but because they were surgically precise. She had drawn a bright red line between law and power, and she made it clear he had already crossed it. For a moment, he stared at her, as if deciding whether to bark back or simply bury her under silence. But instead, he reached forward, pressed the mic button, and muttered, "This court will recess for 15 minutes. His voice had lost its steel. He stood abruptly, his robe swirling behind him like smoke, and disappeared through the chamber doors. The room didn't breathe until the doors clicked shut. But nobody moved, because they all felt it. He wasn't taking a break. He was making a call. Jasmine knew it instantly. This wasn't a tactical pause. It was a power vacuum. She'd forced it. She didn't smile. She didn't even shift. But inside, she felt it. A crack in the granite. Not a win, but an opening. 22 minutes passed before Trevor's returned. But this time, he wasn't the center of the room. Behind him strode a taller, older man, Judge Silas Whitaker. The shift in energy was immediate and visceral. Whitaker's presence was like cold air after a storm, heavy, serious, uncompromising. He walked with the authority of a man who didn't need to introduce himself. Everyone in the gallery straightened. Even the stenographer adjusted her posture. This was a name that had ended careers, a judge whose dissents had become Supreme Court discussions. Whitaker wasn't a legal mind. He was a legal wall. Travers took his seat quickly, almost cautiously, eyes flicking between the bench and Jasmine. There was a tightness in his jaw, a flicker of hesitation in his posture. This wasn't the rescue he had imagined. It was containment. Whitaker remained standing for a moment longer, reading from a slim folder in his hand. Then he spoke, calm even and devastating in his simplicity. Ms. Crockett, I've reviewed a summary of the objections you've raised concerning the procedural handling of this citation and the interpretation of State Code 22F. I understand you believe your constitutional rights were violated. You may proceed from the beginning. No disdain, no theatrics, just a door, one Travers hadn't meant to open. Jasmine didn't move immediately. She studied Whitaker for 2 seconds that felt like 10. She had walked into this room expecting a fight with a man drunk on his own authority. Now standing before her was someone sober, calculating, and possibly more dangerous, but also maybe more fair. She didn't mistake his calm for kindness, but he wasn't dismissing her. He was listening, and that alone meant the rules of the game had changed. From the corner of her eye, she caught Trevor's reaction. Tight lips, fingers tapping anxiously against the edge of his file. He had called in a hammer and got a scale instead, and now he'd have to sit through every word of what he tried to silence. Jasmine adjusted the microphone, voice low but razor clear. Thank you, Your Honor. I will begin by restating my position, not as speculation, but as a matter of fact and legal record. I was fined $25,000 based on an alleged violation of State Code 22F. No documentation was presented, no photos, no reports, no sworn witness testimony. The fine was issued prior to any argument being heard. That is not only a denial of due process, it is the definition of prejudgment. She looked at Travers now, not to provoke, but to confirm that the words were being spoken in the room he tried to control. She turned back to Whitaker. The statute in question is vague, untested in this context, and has been struck down in 3 separate rulings over the past 5 years, all within this jurisdiction. Yet it was used to bypass judicial procedure, silence defense, and impose financial punishment without legal footing. That is not interpretation. That is abuse. Whitaker didn't interrupt. His eyes were on her, steady, his hands folded, his silence weighted not with skepticism, but with scrutiny. The gallery sat frozen, watching a battle they didn't know they'd walked into become something far larger. Not just about a fine, not even about Jasmine. It was about whether a courtroom could still be a place of law when power decided it didn't have to be. Jasmine had just laid out the legal groundwork like a minefield. Statutes, rulings, constitutional violations. But now it was time to expose how this ruling had been built on sand. She turned toward the witness stand, where a man in a stiff, Navy City-issued jacket had taken his seat during the recess. He sat tall, maybe too tall, trying to project confidence. But his eyes gave him away. Inspector Raymond Keyes, the man who wrote the original citation, the man whose unverified word had cost her $25,000. She approached slowly, not to intimidate, but to strip every layer of assumed authority from the ground he sat on. Inspector Keyes, she said, voice flat but alert, you issued the citation under State Code 22F. Is that correct? He nodded once, arms crossed. Yes, ma'am. And you made that decision after inspecting the property in question? Yes. Jasmine paused. Do you have photographs from that inspection? Keys shifted slightly. No, ma'am, I didn't take any. Did you submit a written report? No, but I entered the citation into the system. Her tone sharpened. That's not a report, that's a conclusion. I'm asking if you documented what you saw. He hesitated now. No, I didn't feel it was necessary. Jasmine turned slightly toward the bench, addressing both judges. Let the record show. No photographs, no written observations, no timeline, no witness statements, no environmental readings, nothing but the officer's personal impression. Then turning back to Keys, did you speak with anyone at the site? No. Did you return for a follow-up? No. So this $25,000 penalty was issued based solely on what you saw with your own eyes in one visit? He nodded again, slower now. That's right. I've been doing this for 22 years. I know what a violation looks like. Jasmine stepped closer, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Experience matters, Inspector, but so does evidence. And in a courtroom, what matters most is what can be proven. Tell me, do your eyes record data? Do they produce images? Do they generate measurements the defense can review? Keys didn't respond. He looked down. The gallery was dead silent. The courtroom wasn't silent anymore. It was suspended, held midair, like a breath no one dared exhale. Jasmine had pinned Inspector Keys in his own words, forced him to admit that his entire citation rested not on data, not on documentation, but on his eyes. And now, with that concession echoing in the stillness, she turned toward the bench like a surgeon walking back to the table for the final incision. Your Honors, she began, voice slow, deliberate, as if every word carried legal weight, and it did. There's a precedent I've been saving for this exact moment. Because what we've seen today isn't unique, it's not isolated, and unfortunately, it's not new. She held up a court document, her fingers firm, her tone now carrying the force of a closing argument. In 2018, a case was brought against the city of St. Petersburg. A fine had been levied against a mechanic's garage, $12,000 for alleged visual noncompliance. The officer at the scene provided no photos, no measurements, no written record, just a citation based on his own experience. She paced slightly now, letting her words move with her. The defendant, a 64-year-old war veteran with no legal background, fought back on the grounds that without physical evidence, the fine was unconstitutional. The case made it to the appellate court, and the ruling was unambiguous. She turned to the bench and read aloud, each word like a hammer on glass. An administrative penalty cannot be imposed solely on subjective interpretation. Enforcement requires evidentiary substantiation, measurable, verifiable, and reviewable by the accused. She lowered the document. That ruling was not symbolic. It was procedural law, and it invalidated the entire enforcement policy the city had been using for years. The court didn't just reverse the fine, they vacated the enforcement system behind it. Because a government that punishes without proof doesn't govern. It dictates. She turned now, facing Inspector Keys squarely, giving him nowhere to hide. You claimed experience, and I respect that. But let me ask you again, and please, answer for the record. Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? No, ma'am. Did you write down any notes on site? No. Did you use a checklist, a guideline, a measurable standard to determine that this was a code violation? Keys glanced down. No. Then what was your enforcement based on? He cleared his throat. My judgment. She paused. Let it hang like thunder before the strike. Subjective judgment? Yes. No metric, no measurement. Just your word? Yes. Jasmine turned back to the bench, her voice cold and formal now. That is precisely what Henderson versus St. Petersburg addressed. And it is precisely why this fine is not just flawed, it is void. Because when the state acts without evidence, it isn't enforcing the law. It's guessing. And no citizen should ever be punished on the basis of someone else's guess. Her eyes scanned the gallery, then the two judges. We are not in a courtroom to discuss feelings. We are here to examine facts. And if none exist, then the only thing this court is validating is the erosion of proof as a standard. She stepped away from the lectern now, slow and controlled, like a fighter backing up after a clean strike. There is no foundation to this citation, no chain of evidence, no physical corroboration. There is no procedure, no compliance with due process, and therefore no legal justification for this fine to exist. The words didn't fall flat. They detonated in the minds of everyone present. Even Judge Travers shifted visibly in his chair, lips tight, tapping a pen that no longer seemed to help him feel in control. The city prosecutor, who until now had remained mostly quiet, leaned forward, but said nothing. What could he say? The record was clear, and now so was the collapse. The courtroom was already cracked. Jasmine had exposed the absence of evidence, dismantled the inspector's credibility, and invoked binding precedent with surgical precision. But she wasn't interested in technical victories. Not now. What was at stake wasn't just her own case. It was the message this court would send if it allowed the ruling to stand. So she turned once more to the bench, her voice composed but sharp enough to draw blood. "Your Honor," she said, her tone steady as stone, "before this hearing ends, I need to ask a question for the record, because what happens in this courtroom doesn't stay in this courtroom. It echoes." She let her eyes lock onto Judge Travers. He flinched, barely, but enough. The power dynamic had inverted. "Are you officially declaring that this court has the authority to fine a citizen $25,000 based solely on an inspector's verbal claim, unsupported, undocumented, and unverified?" A few heads turned in the gallery. The court reporter's fingers hovered above her keys, uncertain whether to type yet. Jasmine pressed on. "To be clear, are we saying that no physical evidence is now required to seize that kind of money from an American citizen? Just a word? Just a glance?" She paused. "Because if that's what this ruling represents, we are not in a court of law. We are standing in the shadow of power, unchecked by process." Trevor said nothing. His fingers twitched once, then again. The color in his face drained. It was the kind of silence that doesn't protect, it damns. Because if he said yes, he would validate lawless authority. If he said no, he would contradict his own actions. Either way, he would fall. On the record. But just before the pressure could crush what little control Travers had left, Judge Silas Whitaker leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone alone could have stopped a train. "That question does not require an answer. This court will respond with action." He glanced down at the file, then back up, first to Jasmine, then to Travers. "Based on the totality of evidence, or lack thereof, the fine in question fails to meet the evidentiary threshold required by both statutory and constitutional standards." He turned fully toward the room now, his presence filling the silence like a rising tide. No photos, no documents, no third-party verification, no opportunity for rebuttal. What occurred here today may have been issued under the name of law, but it was not lawfully executed. Trevors's jaw clenched. He stared ahead, motionless, hollow. Whitaker's words grew heavier, not louder. "This court vacates the citation. The administrative fine of $25,000 is hereby nullified, effective immediately." He picked up the gavel with deliberate finality. Every person in the room tensed, as if the next second would burn into their memory. And then, bang! The gavel struck like thunder, one clean, echoing blow. It didn't just end a hearing, it shook the foundation of everything that had led up to it. A man in the gallery gasped softly. The court reporter blinked and resumed typing. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. But in that moment, she became something more than just the defense. She became the answer to every person who had ever sat in that courtroom and wondered if truth could still survive the system. Travers lowered his eyes, his silence no longer strategic. It was surrender. The gavel's final echo had long faded, but its impact lingered like smoke in a closed room. No one stood. No one spoke. The ruling had landed with the force of a tidal shift, violent in its silence. Jasmine didn't react. No victorious nod, no celebratory glance. Just a subtle stillness in her body, Like a soldier who had survived a battlefield others didn't even know they were on. Her folder was already closed. Her arguments were finished. And so was the illusion of authority that had once tried to bury her under silence. Around her, the courtroom struggled to process what had just happened. A man in the back row sat slack-jawed. The stenographer glanced at the transcript with a look of disbelief. Even the prosecutor's pen lay forgotten, rolling slowly across the table, untouched. Judge Travers hadn't moved. His posture was stiff, as if trying to freeze time and undo what couldn't be undone. The power he once carried in his voice, his bench, his gavel, it had all been stripped by a woman who had never raised her tone, only her truth. Jasmine gathered her things slowly, deliberately, as if to show that there was no rush in dignity. Every movement was precise. No theatrics, no flair. Just calm authority grounded in hard-earned truth. She turned, her heels striking the floor with clean, even steps, each one a reminder that the room no longer belonged to those who abused power, but to those who dared to confront it. And just as she reached the threshold of the chamber, she heard it. "I underestimated you." The words weren't loud. They weren't confident. They barely escaped Judge Trevor's mouth, as if choked by the weight of his own unraveling. He hadn't risen. He didn't meet her eyes. But the statement broke the silence like a confession whispered too late to matter. In it, there was no apology, only an acknowledgement. One last grasp at relevance from a man who had just been unseated, not by scandal, but by truth. Jasmine paused, not because she needed to, but because sometimes letting someone feel the full silence that follows their mistake is more powerful than any rebuttal. She turned her head just enough for him to see her profile, her eyes calm, her mouth firm, her presence unchanged. "You're not the first," she said. No venom, no triumph, just the facts. And then she walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Behind her, Travers remained seated, his legacy now fractured by the very voice he had tried to silence. The courtroom doors opened with a hush of air and soft light. Jasmine stepped through them without hesitation, her steps measured, quiet, but echoing with finality. She hadn't won just a case. She had reset the terms of power inside those walls. And she didn't leave as a victor. She left as a precedent. The courtroom had gone still, but the tremors hadn't stopped. Not in the marble walls, not in the halls outside, and certainly not in the minds of those who had just witnessed what many would later call a judicial turning point. Jasmine Crockett had walked out of that federal courtroom without raising her voice, without raising her fist. But she had cracked something open, something old, something calcified. She didn't walk out like a victor. She walked out like gravity, slow, steady, irreversible. And as the doors closed behind her, the ruling she left behind began to do its real work. Because what happened in courtroom 3B wasn't just about one woman or one fine. It was about power. And what happens when someone finally has the knowledge, the courage, and the will to tell that power? Not today. The case was supposed to disappear. It was designed to. The obscure code, the sudden summons, the lack of press. It was meant to be routine. Another rubber stamp on a faceless file, but Jasmine turned it into something else entirely. A reckoning. Within 48 hours, law blogs lit up. Crockett vs. City of Chicago began trending in legal circles. The words "vacated on constitutional grounds" hit forums like a lightning bolt. Municipal attorneys began combing through pending code violation cases. Civil rights organizations issued press releases. A quiet panic swept through local enforcement agencies. How many of our fines couldn't hold up in court? Somewhere in Texas, a single mother facing eviction over a zoning fine found her lawyer reading Jasmine's transcript. In Ohio, a retired veteran who'd been fined $8,000 for a fence built 6 inches too high suddenly had precedent. In Detroit, a disabled small business owner whose restaurant had been shuttered over an unverified health code violation filed an appeal with one sentence: "See, Crockett v. the City of Chicago." That's how legal systems change. Not always through legislation, not always through headlines. Sometimes it starts with one woman standing still in a courtroom and saying, with a voice that doesn't shake. You can't fine people $25,000 without proof. And someone powerful, finally having no answer. The ruling itself was surgical. Judge Whitaker's language wasn't emotional, it was precise. But behind every line was a message. If you want to punish people, you have to prove they deserve it. If you want to enforce the law, you must follow it first. It wasn't a condemnation, it was a reset. The moment his gavel hit the bench, a ripple began. Not just among lawyers and judges, but among citizens. People who had spent years being told they couldn't fight City Hall. People who had been fined, sanctioned, silenced. Not because they were guilty, but because they didn't have the tools to fight back. But now they had Jasmine. And more importantly, they had her case. In the weeks that followed, journalists dug deeper. They found that Judge Travers had overseen more than 700 administrative cases in the past 4 years, many of which shared troubling patterns. No documentation, no photographic evidence, no hearings, just one-sided citations rubber-stamped into punishments. He had once fined a Korean War veteran $5,000 for a garage violation that was never photographed. He had imposed $9,000 in late fees on a grandmother who didn't receive her first notice until 2 weeks after the deadline. None of it had been challenged until Jasmine. Her name began appearing in op-eds, legal panels, and policy drafts, not as a firebrand, not as a revolutionary, but as a line in the sand, a reminder that due process isn't a luxury, it's the foundation. And without it, the system is nothing more than a machine in a robe. There were cities that quietly pulled back enforcement policies, councils that began reviewing procedural standards. In Washington, D.C., a senator referenced her case during a committee hearing on civil enforcement reform. The phrase evidentiary threshold entered the mainstream legal lexicon. In one particularly heated state panel, a conservative representative tried to dismiss the Crockett ruling as limited in scope. A constitutional law professor shot back, "It may have started small, but so did Miranda. So did Gideon. So did Brown." That was the power Jasmine had touched, and she never once claimed it. She never tweeted about the victory. She never stood on a podium. There was no media blitz. She returned to her office, reviewed her next case, and scheduled her next community clinic. But something had shifted, not just in the system, in the people watching it, because every person who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or buried under red tape now had a name to whisper when they walked into court. Crockett. And with it, a question no judge ever wanted to hear again. Where is your evidence? The fine had been $25,000, but the cost of defending against it had always been far greater. Dignity, faith, trust. And for once, the court had returned all of those, not because it was generous, but because one woman wouldn't let it escape its own rules. And as the precedent settled into the bloodstream of the judicial system, Jasmine's quiet strength became something larger than a ruling. It became a standard, a reminder to every inspector, every prosecutor, every judge. Your opinion is not enough. If you want to fine, prove it. If you want to punish, document it. And if you want to silence someone, prepare to be heard instead. When Jasmine Crockett first stood in that Chicago courtroom, very few expected her name to resonate far beyond its walls. She wasn't a celebrity, nor did she have an army of supporters chanting her cause. She was just one attorney, armed with evidence, knowledge, and an unshakable core of determination. Yet what she accomplished under fluorescent lights and a gaze that sought to diminish her ended up traveling across the country like a shockwave. Journalists and legal scholars began dissecting her every move, from the calculated pace of her cross-examinations to the calm precision in her closing statements. Community leaders referenced her case in grassroots meetings, marveling at how she dismantled an entire system of procedural shortcuts by demanding due process. Social media posts circulated clips of her courtroom exchange, each caption praising her poise. Even law professors, normally reserved in their opinions, spoke of Jasmine with admiration typically reserved for legendary figures of American legal history. And through it all, Jasmine remained the same woman who stepped into that courthouse alone, steeled by the conviction that justice was worth fighting for, no matter the odds. In the days that followed her victory, however, the story took on a life of its own. Students in law schools started requesting readings about the Crockett ruling, fascinated by how a single case could shift the discourse on evidentiary standards. Local news segments interviewed small business owners who felt vindicated by her example. Men and women who'd once been fined without evidence, forced to pay simply because the authority said so. Politicians began name-dropping Jasmine in their speeches, both to praise her fortitude and to highlight a growing demand for judicial accountability. The case was no longer about a single hearing or a single fine. It became a mirror held up to a system that had, for too long, relied on intimidation rather than transparent procedure. Rumors swirled that the city's internal review board had launched quiet investigations into judges who acted similarly to Trevor's. Board members who once dismissed citizen complaints as clerical issues found themselves scrambling to draft new guidelines on proof and documentation. And at the center of it all, unwittingly yet undeniably, stood Jasmine Crockett, now recognized as a symbol of hope in a justice system that often forgot its name. Her transformation into an American legal icon didn't happen with the flick of a switch. It happened in a slow burn of news articles, viral blog posts, and whispers in courthouse hallways. One day, a public defender in Seattle would mention her case to a judge, and the next, a law journal in New York would publish a feature titled, "The Strength of Silence: How Crockett Changed the Evidence Game." Community forums in rural counties showed her face on flyers, urging residents to know your rights, because if Jasmine could stand against unfair rulings, so could they. Thousands of miles away in small-town diners, truck drivers debated how she'd managed to outmaneuver an entire courtroom. People who had never met her swore they'd seen her on TV, though in truth, she'd never granted more than a handful of short interviews. The stories about her became larger than life. Some said she broke the judge with a single gaze. Others claimed she'd memorized every statute in the state. The reality was simpler, but no less impressive. She knew precisely what the law demanded, and she refused to accept anything less. In big city offices, where lawyers donned expensive suits and talked strategy over catered lunches, Jasmine's name rolled off tongues with a blend of curiosity and awe. How had one person, with no special connections or political backing, toppled a judicial Goliath so effortlessly? Some speculated she had a secret sponsor, a behind-the-scenes benefactor pulling the strings. Others believed it was sheer fate, the perfect alignment of legal code and a judge's hubris. But those who truly studied her methods saw something else altogether: meticulous preparation. She had dissected the relevant statutes, memorized prior rulings, exposed procedural gaps, and forced them into daylight. Every cross-examination question, every citation of precedent, every calm objection had been a calculated strike. It wasn't luck. It was the unbreakable foundation of a legal mind that refused to be intimidated. In that refusal, she didn't just defend her case. She defended the very essence of what courts were meant to be. Meanwhile, the public's fascination grew, and so did their understanding of the injustice she had faced. They read about how she had been slapped with a massive fine effective immediately, despite having no chance to present an argument. They saw the transcripts where she'd asked, "Is this court declaring it can punish without proof?" and encountered only silence in return. They remembered times in their own lives when they'd felt similarly dismissed, squashed by legal or bureaucratic processes. Her victory seemed to confirm a nagging suspicion in countless hearts, that the system sometimes advanced on fear rather than facts. And if one woman armed with facts and willpower could stand against that fear, maybe others could too. Perhaps for the first time, local communities realized they were not actually powerless against opaque procedures. The lines outside free legal clinics grew, filled with people determined to follow Jasmine's footsteps. In stepping onto that battlefield alone, she had lit a beacon for those who had never felt invited to the fight. As her influence spread, Jasmine herself remained notably modest. She didn't tweet triumphant messages. She didn't call press conferences to bask in the spotlight. Instead, she continued her work, meeting with clients, filing briefs, and occasionally visiting community centers to speak about basic legal rights. She sometimes received standing ovations in these small gatherings, her name called out with the kind of warmth usually reserved for heroes returning from war. Each time she'd smile politely and remind everyone that she was simply enforcing the law the way it was written. Yet the undercurrent of reverence around her only grew stronger. Politicians courted her for endorsements, law journals requested interviews, and philanthropic organizations invited her to speak at fundraisers. Some wanted her to run for office. Others championed her as the future face of judicial reform. But through it all, Jasmine remained the same attorney who had once walked into a courtroom by herself and refused to be silenced. The irony, of course, was that her rise to symbolic status stemmed from a refusal to let a broken system define her. She hadn't sought fame, only fairness. Yet in pursuing fairness, she exposed cracks in the very foundation that once tried to bury her. Suddenly, those cracks were impossible to ignore, not just by law professionals, but by an entire population that saw her story as proof that the system was long overdue for a reckoning. Groups advocating for judicial transparency latched onto her case as a prime example of what happens when power goes unchecked. They argued that, if not for Jasmine's composure and knowledge, many more innocent citizens would continue paying for violations that might not even exist. Nightly news channels played soundbites of her calm, steadfast voice asking a simple question: where is the evidence? And in that question lay a challenge that extended far beyond her single trial, a challenge to every official in every seat of power to hold themselves to a higher standard. Meanwhile, the judge she had faced, Malcolm Travers, found himself under scrutiny like never before. His prior rulings were reviewed, his patterns dissected, and his colleagues asked uncomfortable questions. The man who once wielded the gavel with unassailable confidence was now a cautionary tale, an emblem of what happens when authority isn't balanced by accountability. Documentaries sprouted, featuring interviews with past defendants who'd been on the losing side of Trevor's rulings. Some claimed they never knew they could challenge him. Others admitted they assumed the law was always on his side. But Jasmine's case flipped that assumption on its head. And so Travers went from presiding with unchecked dominance to standing at the center of an investigation that sought to learn how many other times he had ruled first, asked questions later. For a man who once considered himself invulnerable, it was a swift and harrowing fall from grace. Across social media, the hashtags #AskForProof and #Crockett Standard began trending, turning what started as local legal drama into a nationwide conversation about civil liberties. People posted their own stories of fighting unfair fines or challenging contradictory regulations. They tagged Jasmine in heartfelt messages, though few got a direct response. She was busy doing what she always did, defending those who needed it most, often pro bono if they had nowhere else to turn. In certain corners of the internet, she became almost mythic, some calling her the silent lioness of the legal world. But her power lay not in the exaggerations, rather in the understated reality. She hadn't just confronted a broken system, she'd stared it down and made it blink first. No placards or marches were needed, just the unwavering demand for justice and the readiness to back it up with evidence. And that was more powerful than any slogan or rally cry could ever be. By the time the dust settled, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just an attorney. She was a symbol of American law's potential at its very best. Scholars cited her name alongside revered historical figures who championed fairness over force, principle over pressure. Citizens, long ignored by bureaucracies, now had a renewed sense of courage, believing that if Jasmine could do it, maybe they weren't so helpless after all. Courtrooms far beyond Chicago began to feel that shift. Judges were more cautious, inspectors more diligent, and defendants more confident in their right to question power. It was as though a quiet revolution had bloomed from a single courtroom standoff, proving that a lone voice, armed with facts and unwavering resolve, could resonate across an entire nation. Reporters still asked for exclusives. Networks clamored to host her in primetime interviews. But Jasmine never sought the spotlight for its own sake. She cared only that the people who once felt voiceless could be heard. And in that caring, in that unshakable insistence on justice, she became exactly what America needed in that moment, a living symbol of law wielded with conscience. The courtroom had gone quiet, but the impact hadn't. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a case, She shattered a silence that had gone on for far too long. And somewhere out there, a man hunched over a kitchen table, holding a citation he didn't understand, suddenly looked at it differently. Somewhere else, a mother who had once been fined for something that wasn't her fault picked up the phone and called her attorney back. The ripple didn't start with noise. It started with Jasmine's quiet defiance. Because this wasn't just about a legal technicality. It was about something more human, something deeper. It was about those who had spoken and been ignored, those who had asked questions and been dismissed, those who were told, "That's just the way it works," and believed it. But Jasmine showed them it doesn't have to. She walked into a courtroom where power expected compliance. Instead, they got resistance. Disciplined, lawful, unshakable resistance. She didn't scream. She didn't fold. She stood, with a briefcase full of statutes and a spine full of steel. And she sent a message more powerful than any shouted protest. "I know the rules. I came prepared. And I won't be moved." She turned knowledge into her weapon, and it sliced through decades of passive injustice. She used calm as her armor, and no insult pierced it, and her unwavering resolve, the kind that doesn't blink, doesn't flinch, became her blade. The final strike wasn't the gavel. It was her gaze locked on a judge who had just been forced to remember that law is not authority, it's accountability. And in that moment, Jasmine stopped being just a defendant. She became a reference point, a name that would be brought up in hushed courtrooms, a case that would be cited in city hall meetings, a moment that would be whispered about by those who once felt invisible. Because there are battles we fight not with fists or fury, but with facts, with fireproof logic, with unshakable discipline. Jasmine taught that lesson not in a rally, not on a stage, but under oath in a hostile territory, with everything stacked against her. And she didn't just survive it, she changed it. She changed the stakes for people who had stopped believing in fair hearings. She gave language to the silent. She gave courage to the careful. She gave hope to the hopeless, and not through spectacle, but through structure. Because power expects two things from those without it, ignorance or fear. Jasmine brought neither. She brought understanding. She brought clarity. She brought a fight so clean, so controlled, so irrefutable that the system itself had to blink. That's what made her dangerous. Not anger, not rebellion, but competence weaponized. So now in apartment buildings with cracked ceilings and mailboxes full of government letters, someone reads about her and realizes, I'm not crazy, I'm not weak, I'm not alone. Because Jasmine proved it. She proved that even the most complicated law can be understood, that even the most biased courtroom can be held accountable, that even the most immovable institution can be shaken if you walk in ready. She didn't come from legacy. She wasn't born into influence. She didn't flash badges or call in favors. She walked into a trap and dismantled it from the inside. With the law in her hand, the truth in her voice, and no backup but her own preparation. And somewhere tonight, a girl in high school will watch that footage and decide to read her first statute. Somewhere else, a man who's been silent for 20 years will walk into a hearing and say, I want to see the evidence. Because now they know better. Because Jasmine made them believe they could. And when a system makes the mistake of picking the wrong person to bully, and that person turns out to be prepared, principled, and absolutely unafraid, the entire power structure trembles. She wasn't loud. She wasn't arrogant. She was focused. She was lethal. She was inevitable. And that's why the world noticed. But beneath all the tension, all the case law, and every strategic strike Jasmine delivered in that courtroom, something deeper remained. Something no transcript could capture. A message not written in legal precedent, but in human experience. Because this story wasn't just about injustice. It was about what we do when we face it alone. It was about the feeling of being cornered by systems too large to understand, too impersonal to care, and choosing not to shrink, but to rise. Jasmine Crockett didn't fight because she had to. She fought because no one else would. And because somewhere deep down, she knew that when one person pushes back, others begin to believe they can too. Jasmine's story reminds us that sometimes the battle isn't just about a fine, a verdict, or a statute. It's about being seen, being heard, about reminding those in power that silence is an agreement and patience is not weakness, that a person's dignity does not disappear just because a courtroom says nothing in their defense. Her presence in that room wasn't just legal, it was symbolic. It was a challenge to every shrugging bureaucrat and rubber-stamping official who'd grown too comfortable thinking no one would ever look them in the eye and demand justification. She didn't bring chaos. She brought order, the kind they had conveniently forgotten. There is a lesson here for every person who has ever been pushed aside by systems too big to fight. A reminder that what makes us powerful isn't volume, but clarity. Not outrage, but discipline. Not privilege, but purpose. Jasmine didn't walk into that courtroom with a guarantee. She walked in with a choice, to either accept the injustice or confront it. And in choosing confrontation, she lit a torch that others can now follow. Not a war cry, but a whisper of resolve that traveled further and cut deeper. The most powerful moments in human history don't always come from revolutions. They come from resistance. Silent, strategic, unyielding resistance. Jasmine's fight wasn't glamorous, it wasn't televised, but it was real. It was raw. It was a woman standing up when every signal around her told her to sit down. And that's the moment when the world begins to change. Not when the gavel falls, but when someone dares to challenge it. That courtroom, once a place where power operated unchecked, became something else entirely when she stood still and said, "No." And so, what are we left with? A precedent, yes. A legal correction, sure. But more than that, a moral one. That in a world increasingly automated, regulated, and indifferent, where procedures replace compassion and policies silence people, there is still room for courage. There is still space for one voice to remind us all. Power must be earned, not assumed. The law must serve the people, not punish them blindly. And justice, true justice, requires more than judgment. It requires conscience. Jasmine became a symbol, not because she wanted to, but because people needed one. Needed someone to remind them that you don't have to be wealthy, connected, or allowed to make a difference. You just have to stand your ground and know what you're standing for. For every person who paid a fine out of fear. For every voice cut short by a system designed to move fast and look away. Jasmine gave them a name, a face, and a case file that said, they can't ignore you forever. And the beautiful, haunting truth? Jasmine never raised her voice. She never made it personal. She never made it about vengeance. She made it about principle. And principle doesn't need spectacle. It needs presence. It needs consistency. And it needs someone brave enough to carry it into places where it's been forgotten. Now, law schools teach her case as part of their curriculum. Community legal clinics use her strategy as a model. In low-income neighborhoods where residents once feared opening government mail, pamphlets now circulate that read, "Know your rights, start with Crockett." Her quiet storm didn't just change a courtroom, it changed the conversation. It changed the question from, "How much will this cost me?" to, "What proof do they have?" Because ultimately, the greatest impact she made was not inside the courtroom, but outside it. In the hearts of those who watched and realized they didn't have to be afraid anymore. That they could ask questions, that they could challenge false power, that they could stand, maybe not like Jasmine, but because of her. That is the heart of this story. That courage can be contagious. That one act of defiance, grounded in calm, carried by law, and sharpened by experience, can unravel an entire network of silent oppression. So the next time someone is handed a fine that makes no sense, they might look up. The next time a voice is told, "Your argument doesn't matter," it might reply, "Show me the law." The next time someone walks into court alone, they might remember that Jasmine once did too, and that maybe they don't have to leave defeated because of her, because of what she proved, because of the lessons she left behind. Know the law like it's your shield, wear your composure like armor, and carry your conviction like a blade. In a world of unchecked power, these are the tools that matter most. And when one woman used them in the right place, at the right time, for the right reason, she didn't just win a case, she made history with a whisper. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.